Hello and welcome. We are reasoning through the Bible. Today we're going to take a quick break from our verse-by-verse Bible study and have a question and answer session. We periodically get comments and questions from listeners and friends, and so we'd like to today just deal with 4 or 5 of those. So Steve, we'll go ahead and jump into the first one. We have been working through Genesis, and we had a comment from a listener, and it had to do with in Genesis chapter 16, it's talking about Abraham and his wife Sarah. And with that, Abraham, who was not able to have children with Sarah, Sarah was not getting pregnant. So Sarah proposes the idea, hey, Abraham, go into the maid, Hagar, and have a child by her. Well, they weren't really believing God. That was the message of the passage. But there's a verse in there, Genesis 16, verse 3 and 4. Hagar gets pregnant, and she says in there, her mistress, Sarah, her mistress became despised in her eyes. So the word there was that Hagar had despised Sarah. And you and I, Steve, took it to mean, oh, having a child as an heir is a blessing. But we had a listener who was a woman who looked at it from a woman's perspective, and she had a very insightful comment that I think would be useful to pass on. Being a woman, she said, look, it very well could have been when it says that Hagar despised Sarah, it could have been because she didn't want to get pregnant, and that the pregnancy is a lot of work and a lot of physical pain. And so therefore it very well could have been Hagar saying, you got me into this mess, and not liking her mistress, Sarah. So I just wanted to pass that on. Any thoughts, Steve, on that? I just appreciated a woman's viewpoint.
I plead guilty to being a man and not thinking of that. No, I think that is a very good, insightful comment.
And so Hagar could have been sort of bragging on being the bearer of the heir, or could have been just despised because she didn't want to get pregnant. Next question. We had put out a topic, a rather short topic, that dealt with whether or not the Bible was myth, and especially New Testament, Old Testament accounts. And in that account, we had quoted 2 PhDs. One of them was Dr. C.S. Lewis, and another was a Dr. Holly Ordway. And the reason we chose those 2 people was because they had both started out life as an atheist and had both gotten degrees in literature and were experts in old Celtic stories and fairy tale stories and myths and legends and things like this. That was their field of expertise, their academic expertise as an adult, and were in positions at universities teaching literature before they considered the New Testament and became Christians, and then looked at the Bible from that perspective. And so they, at least in our eyes, added some credibility by approaching things saying, here were people that didn't start out with the prejudice of the Bible, but yet looked at these things from the eyes of an atheist, and then came into the conclusion that the Bible stories are just not written like myths and legends and historical novels. And so we had a comment or 2 that dealt with the way we had phrased some of the things in comparing myths and historical novels. So I wanted to talk about that for a minute, is that because there seems to be a misunderstanding of, 1, what these 2 experts were saying, and 2, what is the distinction between myths and historical novels and legends?
One of the actual comments were, these people are literary scholars. They're not biblical scholars. So therefore, your premise that they're saying it's not mythological doesn't hold any water and doesn't have any credence because they're not Bible scholars. But what you're going to explain here is that misses the whole point of what we were making.
Yeah, it misses the point because they weren't speaking from a Bible scholar perspective. They were speaking, and the reason we quoted them is because they were speaking from a professor of literature perspective. They weren't making comments about the ancient languages, the details of Greek or Hebrew, or copy errors in the documents, or some theological topic. They were speaking from the perspective of literature. And their points were that these accounts in the Bible do not match the legends and the myths and the historical novels. And that was the perspective they were speaking from. And it's just a moot point to say, well, this is not a Bible scholar. Well, they weren't speaking. They weren't pretending to be a Bible scholar. And two, they weren't speaking in a Bible scholar topic. They were speaking in a literature topic. So that's the answer to that half of the question. The other half of the question was, we need to, I think, make a distinction between what is a myth and what is a historical novel, and what are the distinctions there? Because it's possible, and I think a lot of people confuse this, it's possible for there to be a myth that is historically untrue, never happened in history, but it still teach a truth. And so I think there's some distinctions there. So first of all, just bear with me for a minute. A myth, by definition, is not factually true. I mean, that's the dictionary definition of a myth, is something that did not happen in history. So by definition, a myth is not something that would happen in history. As an example, there's an ancient Greek myth of Daedalus and his son Icarus. And if I remember the myth correctly, they are isolated on an island and they couldn't escape. So the father, Daedalus, in the myth, he comes up with a way to make wings out of wax and feathers. And he makes wings for himself and his son Icarus, and they're able to fly with these wings. And they escape the island by flapping their wax and feather wings. And the father, Daedalus, advises the son Icarus, be careful and don't fly too high close to the sun or too low close to the sea, because it'll create problems. And so Icarus, they start flying and they're able to escape, and they're flying over the ocean, and Icarus gets kind of full of himself, and he decides, well, I can fly close to the sun if I want to. And he flies too high and flies close to the sun melts the wax, the wings fall apart, and he crashes down into the sea and dies. And so that's the myth of Icarus. And so we can use that as an example. I hope this is not a news to anyone, but that never really happened. It never really happened. There never was a Daedalus, and there never was a Icarus. They're not historical figures. You can't really make wax wings and fly. That never happened in history. So from that standpoint, it's a myth. It was invented by somebody to try to teach a moral, and the moral to the myth is actually a good moral, and it's actually true. The moral is that pride can kill you. Icarus got too prideful and ignored his father's advice and thought he could do something that the wiser, older father advised against, which was fly too close to the sun, and it ended up causing his destruction. So the myth of Icarus, the true part of it, is that pride will kill you. It'll destroy you. Pride will eat up your life. Pride will cause a bad end. That part is the valuable part of the ancient myths. So that part of it, we could say, okay, the moral to the story is a valid moral, which is pride will lead to destruction. The Bible even teaches that pride comes before a fall. But it's still a myth. It never really happened. Now, we had used in our video the term historical novel or legends, things like that. Let me bring in another one, another sort of myth or legend that I think will help contrast to the Icarus one. There's a story, and I was taught this when I was a child in school. The first president of the United States was a man named George Washington. And as the story goes, when George was a young boy, his father comes in one day and says, somebody chopped down the cherry tree. Who chopped down the cherry tree? And as the story goes, young George says, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. And so the father in the story praised young George for telling the truth instead of punishing him for chopping down the cherry tree. Now, that as a historical event never happened. At least all the historians I've read have traced it back to this one biographer that they're convinced there never really was a time when George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. But there really was a man named George Washington. And the point I'm sure the original author was trying to make was that George Washington was an honest man. And so you could take this legend, if you will, and say, oh yeah, there really was a man named George Washington, and he was a very honest man. But the story of the cherry tree never happened. That's false. That would be like a legend or a historical novel.
But it does make a very good campaign story for if somebody's running for president, though, Glenn.
Right. It would make a good campaign story. So we have this story of Icarus that's completely myth. The characters of Icarus never lived. But it teaches a moral that's true. Pride comes before a fall. And then there's the story of George Washington that uses a true historical character, and it teaches something that's true, which is George Washington was an honest man, but it introduces an element that's false. Back to our topic that we did, and it's on our channel, our video that we did, had these two literary experts that were saying, look, we are experts in legends and myths, and we know the difference. And we've studied these. We were interested in them as children, and we studied them academically when we were adults. We've taught them to other people. We can recognize the difference in the way the stories are written between what is a historical novel, what's a myth, what's a legend. There's patterns to them. There's a rhythm to them. There's textual clues that have these things in there. And the Bible's not any of that. That was the clue. So quibbling over the distinctions between myths and legends and historical novel, yes, we understand there's some distinctions. The Bible's still not any of those. And that was the point of the exercise, is that the experts are saying that it's not any of those. So comment, Steve, on that?
Before we move to the next one, Glenn, I do want to say this, that we welcome comments. We want people to comment on our videos. It brings about good discussion. But I do want to say that on the ones that are generally apologetic videos, there are people that they make comments. They don't ever watch the video. They make a comment off of the thumbnail, and they make a comment off of the title. And it's a cut and paste comment where they just go along to other videos or channels and look for Christian channels, I should say, and look for topics so that they can cut and paste their comments and make their little snarky comments and things in it. And we generally won't respond to those. Sometimes we will, because we want to bring out that these people are not watching the videos, that they're just making comments. But on one of these things, you actually had to go and explain the video in the comment. And we discussed that, and I said, that defeats the whole purpose of having the video. So we welcome comments. We want people to comment, but we want you to comment on the actual video contents so that we can have a good, thorough discussion. Some of these people, they say, how come you don't mention this? How come you don't mention that? And it's a 5-minute video where we don't mention it, and then we'll have another 30-minute video, and people won't even address whatever the video might have said. So I just want to kind of insert that here as we're answering comments about that, so that people that are reading comments, sometimes it's done to poison the well, to make people think that a video is saying something that it's not. Watch the video. Just watch the video and then make your comments off of the videos.
We had one person that cut and pasted a 1,500-word article as a comment. And we found it online somewhere. So it was just this huge, long, entire article length comment. And it's just things like that. It's just not the format in a comment. It's just not a good place to respond to things like this. Next question has to do with, and we've heard this off and on over the years, many times, but there's a common misconception out there about whether or not the Bible had been in oral tradition prior to when it was written down as a book. And so there's a common misconception that says, oh, well, the Bible was an oral tradition that was passed down father to son or generation to generation for many years before it was written down. Therefore, we can't trust it simply because, in the example they bring up is an old thing you do with kids called the telephone game. And the telephone game, you'll typically do it with kids, and you'll get as many kids as you can get. You sit them around in a circle, and the first person whispers something in the first kid's ear, and he whispers it into the second, he whispers it into the third, and it goes all the way around the circle. And if you do this with 40, 50 kids, then you compare the first message with what the last one came up with, and it's totally different. And so that's the telephone game, because when it gets passed from person to person, it changes. And so the oral tradition criticism is that the oral tradition is guilty of the same things as the telephone game, and you can't really trust it because it wasn't written down and passed on orally for many years. Well, two misconceptions with this, Steve. One is that the Bible's not really, much of it, I'll even say most of it, wasn't passed on in oral tradition very long before it was written down. And two, that's not how oral tradition works. It's very, very different than the telephone game. Before I dive into details on those, any comments, Steve?
We also have, from archaeological finds, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And while most of the books that are Old Testament books, we call the Hebrew scriptures, are not intact, the pieces that they have match the exact text that we have today. And this was from an Essene community that was about 200 or 300 years before the birth of Christ. And one book in particular, the book of Isaiah, they do have that whole book, and it's virtually word for word what we have today. So while they might be saying, oh, the oral tradition is passed down, it's a telephone game, we do have archaeological evidence that shows that what we have has been kept and preserved throughout the years.
It was indeed kept and preserved in a couple of different ways. One is that many of the books of the Bible were written down by the person who was the eyewitness. So the Old Testament prophets, for example, weren't considered a prophet unless they had something in their lifetimes that came true. You mentioned Isaiah. He had prophecies about some of the battles in his lifetime that people said, oh, he predicted something very fantastic, so therefore he's the true prophet. And so we'll write down all the rest of his messages that happened. So they were written down in the lifetimes of the prophet. The New Testament books, the book of James, I think, 12 years from the time Jesus rose from the dead? The book of James was written. Many of the other books written down 20 years later. And for example, 1 Corinthians, which is one of the earliest books, the scholars believe 21 years. And in 1 Corinthians and Galatians, Paul talks about going back to Jerusalem and checking with Peter and James and John to make sure the stories were straight. So he gets with them within 3 to 5 years, and then again after 14 years before it was written down, within the lifetime of the people that wrote it. And so there wasn't the case that generation upon generation passed down many or most of these books. It's that the people that were eyewitnesses that had compared notes, both ones they very likely had made themselves, but with the other people that were eyewitnesses there, and wrote down what they saw. And we can tell it's not a word for word corroboration simply because the Gospels have some slight differences, just like different eyewitnesses would have. So that's the first answer to the oral tradition question, is that many of the books of the Bible just weren't oral tradition. They were written down by eyewitnesses within a very short amount of time to the events. Secondly, the oral traditions that didn't happen anything like the telephone game. That is a complete, entire, different analogy to the way, especially the Jewish oral traditions happened. Yes, it was the case they had memorized much, if not all, of the Old Testament. And there were things they had memorized that were passed on. But it wasn't like the telephone game. The way the Jewish oral practice happened, this was a group of people in a synagogue for hours and hours on a Sabbath day, Saturday. And you had old men, middle-aged men, and young boys all together at the same time. And they would recite these things and repeat them. And one person would stand up and recite something they had memorized. And it was done by a group of people of differing ages, again, old people down to young people, so that there was no point in time like the telephone game. The telephone game, there's a series of individual points of communication where one person is passing on to the next one, passing on to the next one. And the differences happen with these handoffs from one person to the next. Well, even if you take a generation as a group, there's still never any one point in time where there's a handoff, simply because from the time they were, at least the time they were bar mitzvahed, if not earlier, at 13 years old, they're listening to the old men, the middle-aged men, and the fathers all repeating these memorized things together. And if any of the young people ever got it wrong, oh no, you missed one. The group is going to correct you. So it is a flow of memorization done by a group with no handoffs. And whether or not the critics and the skeptics believe this is the word of God, the people that were memorizing these things believed this was the very words of God. And if you miss anything, I am going to correct you, because it is my job as an elder man to make sure you get this exactly right, because it's going to be your job someday to pass it on to the next generation. And so I'm going to make sure you get it word for word exactly correct.
And that's what you're really saying by having these multiple age groups that are present whenever this is done. You have multiple generations. And through the years, the younger become middle-aged, and then the middle-aged become the elders. And within that, you have 2 or 3 generations that have come into it. So through all of this process, you have it being passed from generation to generation to generation at the same time. That's what you're really talking about when you're talking about multiple age groups in these sessions.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I've even got a modern day example that'll drive this same point home. At one point at my church, I was in a Christian drama group. We would do live performances for Sunday mornings and sometimes evangelistic events in the evenings. And so our drama group was taking a class from the local professional theater company in our town. And there was a professional actor who had been a director, and he was explaining some things to us about acting. And one of the points in the class we were taking, actors, there's always more actors than there are acting jobs. So they always have to go try out for these acting jobs. So the actors typically put together a short monologue, 5-10 minute monologue, and they'll go into an audition, and the director is looking for a part. Will say, okay, let me see, would you do something? And so there's often a choice where they have to memorize a monologue and do it for an audition in order to get an acting job. And this professional actor that was teaching this class we were in was saying, it's advised to pick something interesting and unusual. If you pick something that everybody knows, it's just not as effective. He says, and here's where it applies to what we were doing. He says, if you're going to memorize Shakespeare, you had better get it exactly perfect. He says, because I and all the people like me have memorized every Shakespeare monologue exactly perfect, because we respect the language as professional actors. And if you mess up even one word and you're in my audition, you will not get that job, because Shakespeare is such a high, lofty thing, and it's so well known by so many people. He said, I've memorized all of the monologues. I know all of them word for word. And he says, if you mess up one word, you're not going to get that acting job in my auditions. And so people do this even still today. It's because that actor, that director cared about Shakespeare. His job was in the theater and he cared for Shakespeare. Same thing in our analogy. These people memorizing these things, this wasn't some fluffy thing. They believed it was the very words of God. And so they were going to make sure that the group got it right. And everybody else in the room did the same thing. So that's why oral tradition is never an issue with biblical interpretation. Next question. How can we tell from the text what's a parable and what's a historical account? And Steve, this came up when we were teaching through Genesis, and we got to the point where there was Lot and his family that were in Sodom, and the angels from God came in and said, leave now and don't look back. Well, as they were leaving, Lot's wife turned around, looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. And so what was the comment that we got, Steve, when we heard that?
Well, the comment, to paraphrase, is this is obviously a parable, and they explained what the parable meant.
The comment or the question was, it's obviously a story that's teaching don't look back to the old life, that you're moving on to the new life, the new godly life. Don't look back to the old things. And so that's why it's a parable and not a true eyewitness historical account. And so I think there's just one misunderstanding of what parables are. And two, they didn't listen to, it's like most of what you were saying earlier, Steve, they didn't listen to our teaching because we brought that point out. Yes, we would agree it's obviously a message about don't look back to the old life, that there's a new godly life ahead of you, and don't look back. Sodom was a symbol of sin because it really was a real city that was really sinful. And so that's why, yes, we agree. It's a message of don't look back to the old life. It's also a true historical account. And the reason we can say that definitively is because parables and myths and legends, for that matter, don't read like Book of Genesis. It's like our question earlier. If you just start in chapter 1 and read through Genesis, what are you going to see? You're going to see, went to this place and names the town, had these children, and which one of those children married who. I mean, it's tedious detail of all this person begat that person, and how many years did they live, and how long did they live there before they moved to the next town. Parables don't read like that. If you look in the parable of the New Testament, what do you see? Well, there was a certain woman that lost a coin, and she searched the whole house trying to find it. And when she finally finds it, she tells all the neighbors, I found my coin. That's a parable. And it's like a short story that has a moral to it. Or a sower goes out to sow, and some of the seed falls on the pathway, and some of the seed grows up to be good, fruitful seed. And so those are parables. And the distinctions of parables, they never mention a person's name. They never mention a person, and they never mention the name of a town. Like the parable, Jesus taught several versions of it. There was a wealthy landowner that left his servants, and he goes off and he comes back. Well, they never say he went to name the city, because it's a parable. So what do we see in Genesis? They always name the city. It was Sodom they left, and they named the city they went to. And so it has all the earmarks of a true historical account and not a false parable. Yes, you can make applications to it, and we did. That's when we taught it.
And in the video, we also pointed out that there's archaeological evidence that the cities existed, and we gave that. So I'm not going to repeat it here. Go listen to the video, but listen to the videos before you make a comment, because as you said, we pointed that out. Now, there was at least one parable in the Old Testament. We went through that when we went through the book of Judges, and it obviously was a parable because it was dealing with a judge that wanted to be over the people, and he used examples of branches, trees, and brambles. So listen to our study on Judges and you'll come across that parable. But at the time, we pointed out this is a parable. So again, just listen to our videos before you make comments.
I've heard so many times over the years, Steve, people that draw these conclusions and they never go read the text. The other one I remember hearing that's battered around still, you'll still to this day hear it several times, is when Israel went through the Red Sea and the Red Sea parted. Well, they know generally that the Red Sea parted, but they don't actually go and read the passage because it names the river, it names where the water backed up. It said there was a wall of water on each side. And the explanation from the people that never read it is, oh, well, the tide went out. And it's not a parable simply because it's not written like all the things that parables have. It's got too many detailed specifics. So I'm sure we won't convince everyone with that. And last question, simple one that we got. We were teaching on the Abrahamic covenant in the book of Genesis. And in there, God promised to make Israel a great nation. And one of the questioners is, how can you call Israel great when look at all the evil stuff they've done over the years? They rejected their Messiah. They disobeyed God, worshiped idols through a lot of the Old Testament. Still today, Israel does a lot of things that many people find distasteful and wrong. They've done things I've disagreed with. But so how could we call Israel a great nation when they've done all this sin?
Well, the word that's used as great means large. That's the great nation. He's going to be a large nation. How do we know that? He says, if you can count all the stars, that's how many of your descendants are going to be. If you can count all the sand, that's how many of your descendants are going to be. So it's obviously great nation means very large.
You'll hear the phrase, and I think it was in the Old King James, the great and terrible day of the Lord. It just means large or eventful or long lasting, things like that. So that's the questions for today. If you have any questions, again, you can send them our way. You can find out how to do that on our website, reasoningthroughthebible.com. And we trust that you will indeed, as you have questions, send them to us. We'd love to hear from them. It, again, may be a while. We don't do these very often. And again, some of the questions are just things that we've already answered. If you have questions in between now and then, that we pray and trust that God would answer your questions and solve all your problems.
So you can also put questions in the comments on the videos, and in our audios, there's now a way that you can go in and send a text to us, ask your question or anything else you want to say, and we'll get that message. Thank you so much for watching and listening. As always, we wish that God would bless you.